My name is Eva Svoboda. I'm a research fellow at the Humanitarian Policy Group here at the Overseas Development Institute. Our minds are still fresh from the WHS. We discussed a lot leading up to the WHS and now following on about reforms, about changes. And in fact, there have been a number of reform initiatives within the humanitarian system. And there has been progress. But all in all, a number of issues keep coming up that show that the humanitarian system is in fact not very good at changing itself, reforming itself. And so this afternoon we'd like to look at some of these reform initiatives and to what degree they are actually, they can be implemented. We have an excellent panel this afternoon. I'd like to start on my right. Patrick Says from DFID. Patrick is the head of humanitarian partnerships at DFID. Before that, he was a humanitarian advisor, and before that, for many years, he was working for the International Committee of the Red Cross. Then Julia Stets, she is the lead author of the report and will share the main findings with us. Then on my right, Güçlü Cem Işık is the deputy chief of mission at the Turkish embassy here. Prior to that, he was head of the NATO department at the Ministry of Defense, and before that, Minister of Foreign Affairs, apologies. And before that, counselor at the Turkish delegation to NATO in Brussels. Then to my left is Jane Cocking. She's an independent consultant and former humanitarian director at Oxfam GB. Many years of experience, also with Save the Children and what used to be called the Overseas Development Administration, which is today DFID. Then Amaf Youssef is the Refugee Support Coordinator at the Rethink Rebuild Society, a community-based organization that works towards improving the lives of Syrians in Manchester. Also works with the Syrian charities and networks in the UK. And then last but not least, Barnaby Willits-King, Research Fellow here at the Humanitarian Policy Group, has previously worked for DFID as well, Save the Children, and as a consultant for WFP, OCHA, and the Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Just a couple of things before we start. If you have questions, please hold them until the end. There will be time for discussions and questions. And your phones, please turn them on silent, but by all means tweet #ReshapeAid. And now, without further ado, Julia, you've got the floor.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Eva, for the kind introduction. Thanks for having me. The starting point for our study was exactly what Eva just mentioned. It was this reflection about why do some of the same reform demands come up over and over again. So if you take, for example, the demand to have accountability to affected populations, participation, this is something that was identified already in the Humanitarian Response Review as a major gap. Then was a core pillar in humanitarian reform. It was the purpose later on of the transformative agenda, and now with the grand bargain, again, we see it coming up as this time under the term of a participation revolution. Now, quite often we say that the difficulty of the humanitarian system to change is due to the underlying interests and incentives, but we don't usually unpack this. And this is because I think we are in this business of altruism, right? We're all here to help others. And therefore, we usually focus on, finding out what would be good to do. Yeah? So we create a lot of standards, we set out the goals, and we put out this reform agenda saying this is what we ought to do. Or we develop technically how we could do this. So we have tons of technical guidance elements, but we usually do not look in detail at the underlying interests and incentives. And I believe that this has some negative consequences because this makes us blind to these factors, and it means that it's much more difficult for us to either confront these interests and incentives head on or design our reform efforts in a politically more smart way that, integrates these interests and incentives. So this is where our study started from. And you all have the summary version of the report. You also have the super short version in case you need it. What we did was to pick 3 reform areas rather than the system as a whole. And in each case, first of all, define, well, what actually is the reform proposal that's on the table? Then go through a thought experiment and say, what would happen if we really implemented this proposal fully? What would the humanitarian system look like? And then, if you wish, from this view from the future, try and analyze, well, what does this do to the interests and incentives of the key stakeholders? Let me give you an example to show you better how this works. One of the 3 reform areas we looked at is cash. So this idea that we should increasingly give people affected by crises cash rather than in-kind food or shelter or whatever it might be. The proposal that is on the table is to switch to cash as the default option for all goods and services for which there are functioning markets. Now, if we look at what that means, there are certain countries, of course, where the markets do not function very well, and there are also certain goods and services for which there are no markets. So protection is one of those where it's, you probably cannot go to cash. And in certain systems, health and education might also not be suitable. But overall, we would anticipate that if you really implemented this, you would see around 40% of the total humanitarian budget actually shifting to cash. We also anticipate that this would mean that these cash programs would be handed out as large multi-sector cash programs rather than, a very fragmented little bit of cash for buying the food, little bit of cash for buying the tent and so on, but that it would make much more sense to give this out as a large multi-sector cash program. Now, of course, this means that you would need fewer organizations to actually implement this. So it means that there would be a consolidation of the international actors providing aid. And it would mean that the classical sectors of humanitarian assistance would lose some of their relevance. Not all of it, but some of it, because 40% of the money would move away from them and into this multi-sector cash. It would also mean that there would be pressure on programs that are not cash. On the one hand, because they would be more expensive, relatively speaking. One of the great advantages is that it's efficient to deliver. And the other programs would look more expensive by comparison, but also because they would have less of an economy of scale, they would become more expensive. It might also become more difficult for certain non-cash programs to negotiate the access that they need, where in the past, you would say we have a normative element, but in exchange we deliver a lot of substantial, tangible assistance. This is now would be moving away to other people and might be more difficult. That's just a quick sketch, very, very short sketch of what the move to cash might look like. Now, how would this affect the interests and incentives of some of the key stakeholder groups? We looked at donors, for example, and felt that donors on the whole would come out as the winners of a reform like this, mainly because of the cost efficiency. We know from other studies that delivering cash is probably around 20 to 30% more cost efficient. If we move to large-scale programs, it might be even greater, the gain in cost efficiency. And that's, of course, something that's very, very attractive to donors. It would also, there's a very strong evidence base for cash, and it will also enable donors to say, look, we can position ourselves here as an evidence-driven donor. We do something based on the evidence we have collected. For humanitarian organizations, we really see a split in terms of how this affects their interests and incentives. You have, on the one hand, those organizations that might hope to be implementing some of these large programs, and of course for them it's very attractive. They would gain power, visibility, money. But you also have those that do not have much hope of getting these big contracts. And for them, it would mean, of course, a big loss of market share. It would also entail quite some pressure on their overhead costs because of this cost efficiency that we have. And they might have some concerns about their non-cash programs. Anyway, this was just more by way of illustration of how we would expect this reform to play out. We did go through a similar analysis for other stakeholders, mainly affected governments, sometimes also the private sector, obviously affected populations. And we play this through not just for cash, but also for the reform for protection, for strengthening protection, and for strengthening accountability to affected populations. Since I can't go through all the findings in detail, I just want to walk you through 2 or 3 of the overarching, sort of more general elements that were common to these 3 areas that come out. The first one that we found was that the reform proposals themselves were actually surprisingly unclear. So it took us weeks to try and distill what actually is the reform proposal on the table for each of these cases, despite the fact that these are areas that we've been speaking about for a long time. When we were researching into this a little bit, we came across a concept that describes quite well, I believe, what happens here. It's called organized hypocrisy. And it seems to be quite a common phenomenon in world politics that you deal with fuzzy concepts. They make it much easier to gain a political agreement, to get consensus that this is something that we want to move forward. But everybody is still allowed to have their own interpretation of what this means, and therefore will not actually end up implementing much change. So organized hypocrisy seems to be out there, and it seems to be one of the elements that prevents change in each of these reform areas. It also makes it much more difficult for us to see how all these different reform efforts actually go together, where they clash or where they come together, and for us to develop something of a more holistic vision of how might the humanitarian system change. Then a second aspect that we found across all 3 areas was this theme of consolidation of actors. I told you how the reasoning goes within cash. There are similar arguments in protection and in accountability to affected populations, each saying that if you want to implement these reforms effectively, you will need fewer international organizations working there, and some that are less organized by sector and more organized by area. A third thing that we found was that if we look at the constellation of interests, we try to see, who has a positive interest here in pushing this reform and who has power as well to push this through. And it was quite clear to us that the cash reform agenda has the most positive constellation of interests, because it's very attractive to donors, as I tried to argue, and it's quite attractive to those larger organizations that can reasonably hope to be the implementers of these large-scale contracts. Also, the cash reform has some positive synergies with other reform goals, especially with accountability to affected populations, because you are effectively handing over quite a lot of power and control to the affected population. And therefore, we thought that out of this reasoning, we should actually give priority to implementing the cash reform, because it's easier and because it has positive synergies. The final point was that we felt that this analysis showed us that at the moment we are really reaching the limits of what you can achieve through a process of voluntary self-reform. So in the past, we have always relied on the humanitarian system reforming itself voluntarily. It was very interesting to me when we discussed this at the Humanitarian Summit a couple of weeks ago, and we put it under the theme of reform or revolution. We had a number of people that we thought of as representatives of the humanitarian system, of the establishment, if you wish, calling for revolution and calling quite loudly and in a very convincing sort of way. Yet when you look at the outcome of the Humanitarian Summit and the grand bargain, which is probably the most tangible element that we have there, I think we are very much seeing more of the same. We are still in a situation where we want to rely on commitments that people have given, and it's a little bit of a donors commit something and humanitarian agencies commit a little bit. But we have not agreed to a more fundamental change, at least in my reading. And to me, this would be one of the aspects most interesting to discuss with you here today, to understand how can we move beyond this? What kinds of forces could actually help trigger some of these more fundamental transformations that we believe we need.
Thank you very much, Julia. And my apologies, I introduced Julia as one of the lead authors, but she's also, equally importantly, the director of the Global Public Policy Institute. Julia, what struck me when I read the report was, like you say, the interlinkages between the different reforms. So we look at one and we might actually be able to see some progress, but when we look at the bigger picture, it looks a bit differently. We'd like to now unpack some of these questions. Many discussions focus around financing. We continually hear about the gap between what is needed and what is actually provided in terms of funding for humanitarian action. And during the WHS, but before that as well, the term broke, not broken was termed. Now, is the humanitarian system broke in terms of it just needs more money? Or is it broken, meaning that the system needs to change? Jane, I'd like to pose that question to you. Is the system broke or broken?
Thank you, and thank you very much indeed for a fascinating and thought-provoking report. My answer to this question is quite short, but quite broad. So it's a sort of fat answer, really. It's both, but it's neither, I think, is it would be my answer, having thought about this quite a lot since the term was first coined. Arguably, at the moment, there is as much money flowing through the system that the system as it is currently conceived and implemented can cope with. And is it broken? Well, it's not completely broken because it delivers a level of assistance for millions of people every year. But at the same time, it most certainly needs to be stronger and it needs to be more efficient so that it can absorb more resources for more people. And the challenge is how we make that happen. So I don't think it's a binary choice. I think it's both and neither.
And from the perspective of a host government, Jem, we just spoke before the event. Turkey is currently hosting 3 million refugees, 2.7 Syrians, and the rest are Iraqis. From your perspective, how do you see that system?
Well, it's when you're one of the largest donors in the world, certainly the largest by per capita income. When you host that many refugees and when you have just hosted the first ever humanitarian summit, it's very difficult to summarize things in two minutes, but I'll do my best. Well, the international community is definitely facing tremendous challenges. We've got the worst humanitarian situation, I think, that we've seen since the Second World War. I think that goes without doubt. And the humanitarian crises are becoming ever more complex, transcending more borders, and the gap between the increase in needs and limited resources is growing. So I think it's safe to say that the international humanitarian system, which was designed many years ago, can no longer adequately address the increasing complexity of today's humanitarian challenges, crises. So the challenges are increasing, and the system is no longer adequate. Therefore, that requires an even more focus on efficiency and effectiveness. Add to that the millions of refugees that at least the world has to cope with, but certainly we have 3 million that we are hosting. I think we need a different look. Now, of course, a couple Turkey's hosting nation status with the donations that we make across the world, we've got this unique experience of I think the perspective that we try to bring to the humanitarian summit to start with. We think that it needs to be. There are two points that we've been making constantly. One of them is the working practices in the field. That coordination through the UN needs to be better. Ideally, the affected states should assume this coordination, but in the absence of that being, if that's not possible, I think we need to find the international community at least needs to step in and should rapidly find means and ways of doing that on behalf of the affected state and the people. We need well-defined models that we can do this with, better cooperation, not just among UN bodies operating in the field, but also between recipients, donors, the international community. So and all of this requires a higher degree of interoperability, so that we avoid duplication, overlapping. So. That is these are all things, and these are all ways in which we thought that efficiency could be improved. Add to that, of course, the broke side of the equation that you mentioned. I'm not sure if it's necessarily broke, but it certainly needs securing. It needs a better way of securing financial support. We've always advocated that it would be ideal to consider creating a robust global reserve fund, and we've been saying that localization of humanitarian response is crucial wherever possible, so that it's planned, initiated, and conducted with close consultation with affected states. Have it and to have it more user-friendly, tailor-made. Get the local economies going. The structures are so that the local structures are used, reinforced, and utilized. I suppose this is a point in which I can turn to the grand bargain that is now being mentioned after the World Humanitarian Summit. The grand bargain includes a commitment to channel 25% of financing to the national and local responders as directly as possible by 2020. So this is a most favorable outcome from the summit, I would say. And the lessons learned so far have clearly shown us the growing importance of the humanitarian development nexus. That is the joint and concerted implementation of humanitarian and development assistance. So the humanitarian aid and development going hand in hand. We think, again, to increase efficiency and effectiveness, that's required a multi-year planning approach instead of one-off operations. And technological advances should be better used. And for that, if you're to go for using technological advances better, then you need to work together with, of course, the private sector, the academia, along with other non-traditional humanitarian actors. Innovative approaches need to be. If you're thinking of, if you're looking at the question of broke or broken, you certainly need innovative approaches to financing humanitarian action. And one of the, just to give you an example, we for the Syrian refugees that we're hosting, we came up with the e-voucher program. So instead of, for example, providing 3 meals a day for the Syrian refugees that we host, we have given them magnetic cards for the ones at the temporary protection centers, so that they can actually go and do their shopping with the magnetic cards. Which, one of the, off the top of my head, it increases social interaction. In a marketplace, it obviously helps their rehabilitation process. And they provide for themselves. They buy what they need. They eat what they eat what they need, what they would wish. So there are ways in which the efficiency and effectiveness could be increased. Is my long answer to your short question.
Thank you very much. One of the first things that you mentioned was coordination. And I remember over the last few years, we often spoke, well, if only we had better coordination, things would actually be better. But in fact, what you argue, Julia, is it's not that, it's the consolidation. This means that some small organizations and UN organizations with a focus on a single sector could potentially lose out in this reform. Is there, in fact, a need for greater consolidation within the humanitarian landscape? And I'd like to hear from Amaf from your perspective what that would mean.
Well, Hi everyone. Well, for Syrians, I am in my capacity. I deal with a lot of Syrians who have been in refugee camps and then they came to the UK. A lot of people who need the services, they're not getting them. The way the system that's working now, it's there's a fundamental problem because it's like a government getting funding from different resources and then operating through different departments, but it's really slow and it's not getting the people who need the big organizations support. They're getting it from grassroots organizations, which is a big problem. Also, we have to ensure that the governments are or the international community is fighting corruption. We have extra layers that to protect and to track the money, how is it going, but then that's causing the system to become slower. So if we're going to consolidate and if we're going to work together to create a new layer, it's not going to work out. I guess it needs different perspective. It needs to rely more on grassroots organizations, especially that's a lot of these organizations operating in Turkey, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon. They even provide employment for locals, so it means people are empowered themselves to help themselves. It means that people know from first-hand experience what the recipient part of the equation needs, so they know how to deal with them. They know what kind of support they should provide. So yes, I'm with Consolidation, but it's a different perspective. We should look at it in a different way.
That's a fair point. And Jane, in your experience, what would be the advantages or disadvantages of a more consolidated approach?
Well, I'd like to sort of pick up where Amaf was speaking, because I think I can entirely see we need to change. There's no doubt about that, and I can see the attraction of consolidation. But I think we need to look, maybe sort of project ourselves 5 years, 10 years hence, and if we pursue a consolidation agenda at the expense of others, then I think we potentially end up with a sort of almost a supermarket approach, in the sense of, a few big players. And I don't think that would be the end point that we need to get to, because then that drives you down a route where the tendency is towards one size fits all, and that would not in itself be a good thing. So, at the risk of appearing, sort of pedantic, I would say it's not consolidation, it's coherence, which has many of the same characteristics, but it means, as the report says, we need clearer definitions of what we're all achieving. We do need to be clearer as agencies what our distinctive competence is, so that can then be offered in a particular context, and we reduce the number of agencies perhaps working in a particular context on a particular issue or in a particular way. But that's quite a way from saying, right, we have global international consolidation. Because I think the other issue as well, which I think plays to what you were saying, Amaf, is that if we shift the international part of the system entirely in that direction, then what the other big piece, which is absolutely crucial, which is much clearer and commitment and action on bringing the national, local parts, agencies together with international ones, will then become more difficult. So I think that's another thing. So I think much clearer coherence globally, collaboration much more actively in particular contexts, which will probably lead us towards consolidation in specific contexts, but I don't know that global consolidation overall would, if we project ourselves 5 or 10 years forward and assume success, would be quite what will serve people best and which will enable the other agendas that the report talks about very lucidly in terms of accountability and protection to really come through.
Thank you. So not a one-size-fits-all.
No.
I'd like to move now to cash transfers. In fact, cash transfers still are a minority of, or it used rarely, even though we speak about it a lot. The report says that it could be up to 70 to 80% of all humanitarian contexts, in fact, could use cash transfers. Is a shift to cash-based assistance the solution for a more effective humanitarian system? And I'd like to pose that question to Patrick.
Thanks, Eva. Well, I definitely think that it's not a panacea. I mean, we will always need emergency medical services, emergency relief services, even in some contexts where markets are not existent. We'll definitely need protection delivered through the international humanitarian system. However, Julia has pointed out the fact that we now have a very strong body of evidence that cash transfers has advantages that in-kind doesn't have. The first of which is that it gives dignity to beneficiaries. It gives them the choice to decide what they need rather than us giving them what we can supply, basically. It's also better value for money. The supply chain for cash is cheaper. It's just cheaper than the supply chain for all the different in-kind things that we normally deliver in humanitarian responses. We also know that it has a broader economic impact. A study that we actually commissioned in Lebanon showed that the multiplier effect of cash on markets and the wider economy was 2.13, whereas even vouchers, although they're a form of cash transfers, only had a 1.5 effect. So it's very clear that injecting cash in situations where the economy is working, where markets are existent, is actually a good thing also for development purposes and recovery purposes. And I also think that cash can somehow promote better collaboration and better coherence, as we've heard recently, in the system, just because multi-sector cash would require actually actors joining up together and assessing what people's needs are on an economic basis rather than by sector. And that would require a different way of working compared to what we've got now. And I think that's what the Grand Bargain is trying to do. And there are specific commitments there on cash. We've co-championed that work stream with WFP. Unfortunately, we haven't reached an agreement on a target because I think some agencies and some donors are quite far from, let's say, 25% or even 40% as the GPPI report suggests. But we've got UK commitments to the Grand Bargain and to the World Humanitarian Summit that will look at actually potentially doubling the proportion of humanitarian assistance that we deliver through cash. I think the key now is going to be implementation of those commitments that were made at the Grand Bargain, and that's where the question of consolidation, I think, is going to be quite interesting. I'm not sure I would agree with the report in terms of, the way forward is consolidation for everything. I think we probably need to unpack that supply chain of cash. We might think that actually the actual delivery of cash could be consolidated quite significantly because it could be done through electronic cash transfers, and that actually could be consolidated quite fast in a way. But I think there will always be a need for the assessment of who needs how much cash, and also the monitoring and the evaluation of whether people actually got what they needed and spent that cash on what they needed.
Thank you, Patrick. You mentioned initially the advantages for affected populations of cash, that they more dignity, they have agency. I was wondering, Amaf, whether you would like to elaborate on what a major shift in cash transfer would mean for affected communities.
Well, I don't know if it's really you cannot tell. It depends on the person himself. Some people might find it less dignifying to getting money without doing anything. Some people might not. It depends on the personality. It it could be a good way for people to feel independent in a while. However, and it could be cheaper on the supply chain, but then when you're talking about a local economy, we have to be really careful about this, because if we are handing people cash and some people chose to spend their cash different than others, so let's say if they went to the local market and they wanted to rent out of the area where they are put, it means that they are affecting the local market. You will find the prices increasing. It happens all the time. Sometimes in Syria we had a system where the government would give a grant for all the people who are like some sort of pay raise, and immediately the prices goes up. So then it's not effective. So then these people wouldn't be able to buy what they need, which is what worries me the most. If we're going to implement it, I think we should really consider country by country case, and we should create some sort of safety network to make sure at least the basic human rights are given. Everyone is taking them, and then the rest could be dealt with. The e-voucher system in Turkey, in Zaatari camp in Jordan, they also had similar system. I think it's quite effective. I was reading about it a lot, and it seems it's getting a really good feedback, because people get to choose what they want without being forced, and they can cook what they want, which is quite important in the Syrian culture. So yeah.
Thank you very much. We spoke about the need for willingness to reform, willingness of stakeholders to change. Now, we know that the humanitarian system can be quite competitive, and so it depends in a way on those actors wanting to reform for these reforms to be implemented. Jane, I would like to hear from you whether there is a real appetite for that deeper shift.
Thank you. This was the area of the report I found most fascinating and challenging, and it really pushed me into personal reflection and reflection on experience over a long time in different agencies, because I think the straight answer to your question, is there an appetite for change? Yes, there most certainly is. There is no question. I do not know a single person in the humanitarian world who says, this is actually going pretty well. Let's just dial up this bit or whatever. You only need to put a group of humanitarians in a room to sense the frustration and the desire for things to be different. But I think what I would prefer to see it as are unpacking what underneath is what are the real barriers that stop that frustration really being addressed and really being dispelled. And Julia referred to a constellation of interests, and I think that is a really helpful way of looking at it. Because yes, there is competition on occasions, but I think and again, this is not to be defensive, and I'd be interested to know what the audience thinks, quite genuinely, most of that comes from a desire to do more, do better, do faster, and that constant self-challenge. And so I think it's really helpful that the taboo of talking about this self-interest piece has been unlocked and been addressed. But I think we need to look more at answering the question of why does this happen? And I think, and again, this is not falling into, I hope, the trap of always saying, well, of course, there's always something else that needs fixing, and once we fix problem A, problem B will come up. But I think unless we look at the collective constellation, as you say, we're not going to make progress. So what does that mean? It means the external framework and both politically and the framework of public opinion. And that is not easily changed. I think the one thing I would say in the report that I disagreed with was the fact that a public campaign to explain cash would be, sort of a relatively straightforward thing to do. Changing attitudes and behaviours is phenomenally difficult, and we need to get our heads around that collectively. I completely agree. But also, as somebody who's worked in the system for a long time, and I completely recognise that might make me slightly blind to some of its faults, the trade-offs of doing something in the present versus preparing to do something better in the future are absolutely fundamental, and the recurring challenge that everybody faces. If I don't invest these resources in a current response, but choose to put them in a longer term shift, then what's the impact of that today versus the impact of that tomorrow? And that is a phenomenally difficult thing to do. And what that leads us to do is the old phrase, but I think it's really still very current, is that for me, the key challenge we face within the humanitarian world is we are constantly trying to fix the plane while still flying it. And I don't know many airlines that would regard that as an acceptable policy. And that's, I think, what we need to really address. So we need to take the debate out of that heat of the moment and say, well, look, where is that longer term investment going to come from in such a way that it does not detract from the scarce resources that are currently available for some of the most intractable and growing humanitarian crises in the world, which brings us round to our first question on broke, not broken. And then maybe one final point, because I think it is crucial and it is important to perhaps recognise it and out it. There is an emotional and a behavioural mindset within many humanitarians, and I know that I am one of them, which tends towards that immediacy. And it's how we expand the cadre of people to bring in those with the longer term view and the longer term thinking. I mean, a colleague said to me many years ago, when perhaps there wasn't an absolutely overwhelming workload of response on one of those very rare occasions, and he said, this is the moment I've been waiting for, when I have time to do proactive work and not just reactive. And I've come in this morning and I don't know what it is and I don't know how to do it and I'm a bit bored. And so there's something about how we expand our emotional and behavioural mindsets, and that may not be by changing all of us, but by certainly bringing in and broadening that cadre of people, I would suggest.
Thank you, Jane. In terms of driving the change, there's a lot of expectations from donors. And my question to Patrick and then to Jem, are donors currently doing enough to promote necessary changes?
Well, I think that we as donors are probably not doing enough, but I think that we're doing more at the moment than we've ever done before. And we should be conscious of that. I mean, I think that the study is very useful in highlighting how donor interests and behaviours help or hinder reform. That's very clear. And using very concrete examples of reforms also helps, I think, to highlight those. But I think we need to recognise that we're not, a single community of donors, basically. Each of us have got different institutional setups. We've also got different constraints. In the UK, I think we're rather privileged. We've got a multi-year budget that in DFID we can use quite flexibly. It's not divided between humanitarian and development budgets. It's not pre-allocated to a set of donors that have been pre-selected. And as a result, I think it's fair to say that we're slightly ahead on a number of reform areas, particularly around the grand bargain. But we still need to do a lot of work, for example, on reporting requirements and harmonising and streamlining that. And we also want to do more on all those reform areas. We're not there yet. But I think the grand bargain precisely offers a moment of donor reform that is without precedent in recent years, I think. And I think generally that agreement is really to put aside mandates and national interests and other interests, I would say, and work towards collective outcomes through collective action. And that agreement alone, I think, is quite important. And the fact that, it's not the ISC separately from donors that has made it, it's donors and agencies, including NGOs. So that's quite significant. And I think that the fact, for example, that the US OFDA has just confirmed that they are actually going to be able to contribute to country-based pool funds, for instance, or that ECHO is looking at multi-year planning, if not, funding or budgeting, or the fact that Germany, who's currently growing its humanitarian action budget, is really looking at doing that on a multi-year basis is really positive, and I think we need to make the most of it. I think the key is going to be around implementation of those commitments once again. So we're currently discussing what that implementation mechanism is going to look like, and that's going to be quite important. And it's going to be quite important to ensure that the assessment of progress of those voluntary commitments is done on an impartial way.
Thank you. And Jem, from the perspective of the Turkish government?
I think Turkey is in a unique position on this question. I mean, when you are the largest donor in terms of per capita income and the largest refugee hosting country in the world, according to the UN, I think when you ask, are the donors doing enough to promote the necessary changes, I can probably say probably not. But I think it's less of and couple that with the question of willingness. I don't think it's so much a question of willingness for change as much as it is a realization that a change in approach is necessary. So that's one part of my answer, and the second part is, unfortunately, it's saddening to say this, but there is a deficit of solidarity in the international community on burden sharing and responsibility sharing, when we need more selflessness. I mean, that was just talked about, the selflessness. Let me open that up. As far as the change of approach is concerned, we've come to realize, and I think all of us know this by now, humanitarian crises can be alleviated with humanitarian aids. But they can never be eliminated. Alleviation, yes, but elimination requires sustainable development. A holistic and sustainable approach, combining humanitarian assistance with development tools, must be put in place. It's actually more cost effective for donors in the long run if they combine it with humanitarian with development assistance, is what we've come to see. We've in our experience in terms of especially in sub-Saharan Africa, shows that a joint strategy can reduce the vulnerability of countries and increase their resilience in the face of future shocks, and that would require less humanitarian assistance in the future. For example, in our policy of assistance for Somalia, when they had the famine, the severe famine in 2011, following the visit of our then Prime Minister, now our President, all segments of the Turkish society mobilized. It was in a relatively short span of time, we had several projects put into action, which consisted of humanitarian and institutional capacity building, and we looked at ways of providing services such as education, sanitation, healthcare, in addition to humanitarian aid and food and medicine. So different agencies got involved, such as the Turkish International Development Agency, the Disaster Management Agency, the Turkish Red Crescent, in addition to the private sector, the business sector rather, the civil society, municipalities, and they came up with a more encompassing, a more complete assistance, and I think we're seeing some of the benefits of that now. Turning to the lack of, so that's the change in approach that we think is necessary. Turning to the deficit in burden and responsibility sharing, that of course brings us to Syria, from Somalia to Syria. We are hosting 2.7 million Syrians, and it's the biggest humanitarian crisis of a protracted nature in the modern era. What we have done when we were confronted with millions of people coming to the border is we set up temporary protection centers. We made sure that for those people that were there was free healthcare, free education, vocational training, psychological support, and that is, of course, in addition to the people in the streets. I mean, they share our cities. I mean, we have about 270,000 people in temporary protection centers, but more of that, obviously, almost 10 times, is with us, and they can still today go into any hospital, any education center, and ask for their free education and healthcare. We have worked with the United Nations to make sure there's special programs for girls, women, for children. We tried to make sure that there's no lost generation, and we've been calling for assistance. And here's where it gets a bit troublesome. We've been calling for international assistance, saying that we cannot do this by ourselves since 2012, as early as 2012. But there has been some international help, but it's negligible. I mean, when you look at what's trickled in from the international arena, approximately 7 to 8% of the total cost that's being borne by Turkey is being covered internationally, which means that 92 to 93% of that burden is with us. $10 billion has been spent just on those at the temporary protection centers. When you count the other people, when you count, according to some estimates, it's $25 to $30 billion. And all of this is, of course, happening. You have to remember where Turkey is. All of this is happening when rockets are falling into bordering cities on the Syrian border, such as Kilis. I mean, Kilis hosts 50% of Kilis, which is a town in bordering town in Turkey, is Syrian refugees, and the town is fine with hosting the refugees. It's all fine, but all this is happening when rockets are coming in from Daesh on the other side of the border. Yes. Yes, there's an increase in awareness, but unfortunately, more burden and responsibility sharing is what we like to see. And luckily, if I can say this, the summit in Istanbul was a wake-up call, I think, in many ways for action in terms of global momentum and political will. It was acknowledged that the humanitarian development divide should be transcended, which is, I suppose, what I said in the first part of my answer. The commitments for action document will be released by the UN, which we look forward to, and the Istanbul summit is only the beginning, we hope, and not the end of the journey. So, I suppose hope dies last. I'm an ever optimist, we look forward to international solidarity and burden sharing. Thank you.
Thank you, Jem. Which leads me nicely, the World Humanitarian Summit, to our last speaker. Barnaby, if you could reflect on some of the arguments that were put forward by the speakers, but then also look back at the World Humanitarian Summit and on some of the initiatives that were proposed there and what that might or what the future might bring following the World Humanitarian Summit.
Great, thank you. Hard act to follow. Lots of really interesting points from the rest of the panel and the report as well. I think really stimulating some important discussion. But just to try and sort of bring it together a bit and reflect on what happened at the World Humanitarian Summit and where things might go. And I can't profess to having all the answers, but maybe sort of provoke and summarise some of the discussion. I think what we heard from a number of the panellists was really this question that it's not as simple as the system being broke or broken. There's clearly a shortage of money. There's clearly things that need to change, and I think Jane expressed very very crisply the sort of the challenges around what change might or might not need to look like. And I think differences of opinion on what the solutions might be, and this really chimes with the report that we put out before the summit, Time to Let Go, which looks very much at this crisis of legitimacy, capacity and means in the formal humanitarian system, and the need to let go of control to build a more diverse system. I think one of the really interesting discussions that I particularly found interesting was this question of consolidation. I think in the report, that point about consolidation coming out of perhaps a lot of these reform initiatives. I shared some of, I think, Jane's concerns about, and others about, whether this was necessarily the consequence that we were going to lead to more consolidation. I certainly think it could happen. I think it might need to happen. Whether it will happen, and whether it's going to be the best solution, I wonder. And I think the point about, maybe in some contexts, there are different models where consolidation could be important, and others where it wouldn't be so useful. I think the kind of question of whether we end up with the supermarket or supermarket and corner shops meeting different needs, I think in terms of models is really important to look at, and particularly linking then this question of localization and how you build a system which actually enlarges the tent, perhaps, or maybe, as we say in our report, pitch the tent somewhere else. Or perhaps you have more tents and you have a multiple sort of centres of gravity. But I think that the key question that we've really tried to explore today is this question about the willingness of stakeholders to change and what's preventing change. And I guess, having sort of been an observer and a participant in lots of these reform processes over the years, I guess I'm both a pessimist and an optimist, like Jem. I think change is a given. We're all our organisations are changing all the time. I think that's something everyone experiences, and I think the humanitarian system, whether depending what it's called and the particular label, there is going to continue to be change. It's a question of how you shape and manage it and make it effective. And I think the grand bargain, on the one hand, really a good thing to bring together a focused agenda for change, and some really good individual initiatives within that, sort of localization, transparency, cash, lots of interesting networks. But I think not the revolution or the sort of game changer that perhaps a couple of years ago everyone was hoping maybe the summit would deliver. And also, I think the way that the different parts of the outcomes from the summit might work together in terms of things that don't necessarily not very consistent. So I'm sort of pessimistic that the total is less than the sum of the parts. And as Patrick says, it's really all about the implementation. And also, I think I've become increasingly pessimistic with every sort of day since I left Istanbul, and kind of the conversations that I've had and sort of reflecting on field visits, that the system is very slow to change. There's a lot of vested interests, a lot of barriers within the entrenched bureaucracies. And so although there are some really important initiatives out there, the idea of letting go of control and power and changing mindset, that is going to be a real uphill struggle. And I think, just a sort of final point about the report, to return to that, I think the report makes a really important point about the nature of reform, that reflecting self-interests of actors is really important. Politically smart reform, and I think extending it beyond the sort of the core group of Western donors and big agencies in the grand bargain, to look at a broader base. And I think Jem mentioned the private sector, rising donors, including Turkey, and being really upfront about the politics of reform, who wins, who loses. And so really unpacking it even further. So I think a sequel to the report would be a fantastic way to really then take it even further and try and get reform really happening.
Thank you, Barnaby. On that note, we'd like to hear from the audience here and online what your thoughts are on some of these arguments that were put forward by the panelists. There's a microphone going around. If you could introduce yourself and ask a question or a brief comment. Who would like to go first? John, please.